All right, so get this. We're diving into, the world of Frank Lloyd Wright, but not just his buildings, his
Yeah.
ideas.
Right.
This wild concept called Broadacre City.
Okay.
Imagine if someone took a wrecking ball to our cities and said, everyone gets an acre, let's start over.
Wow.
That's right for you. We've got a stack of articles here.
Okay.
And trust me, this isn't just some dusty history lesson. We're
Right.
talking utopian ideals, the roots of suburbia,
Uh-huh.
and honestly, some stuff that feels shockingly relevant even today.
Yeah.
Luckily, I'm not alone in this. Our resident expert is here to help us sift through it all and connect the dots.
Happy to be here.
You always have a knack for making sense of these complex ideas.
Well, I'll try my best. With a visionary like Wright, his ideas were often controversial,
Right.
but always thought-provoking.
That they are. So let's set the stage.
Yep.
Why did Wright even dream up this Broadacre City in the first place? What was he reacting to? One article quotes him using this really vivid phrase, cave dwellers.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit harsh, but it seems like he was getting at something deeper about city life in the early 1900s.
Yeah, picture this. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Cities are exploding with people crammed into tenements. Factories are dominating the landscape. And he saw this and he felt it was crushing the human spirit, He believed people were becoming disconnected from nature, from each other,
Yeah.
even from their own potential.
So the cave dweller thing, it's about feeling trapped, right? Like we've built these concrete cages for ourselves, even though we're capable of so much more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Arain believed that the cities of his time, with their emphasis on industry and efficiency, were actually holding people back from a more fulfilling, more human way of life. And that's where Broadacre City comes, in his radical attempt to reimagine society from the ground up.
And reimagine it he did. One article pointed out that Broadacre City aimed for about 2.5 people per acre. Now, I'm no mathematician,
Right.
but compare that to something like Manhattan today, which is over 100 people crammed into that same space. It highlights just how different his vision was.
It wasn't just about density, though. That's a powerful example. Wright envisioned a world where everyone, regardless of income or social standing, would have access to at least an acre of land. This wasn't just about having a backyard. It was about redefining the relationship between humanity and nature, about decentralizing power and resources, and giving individuals the space and freedom to create their own destinies.
I'm picturing sprawling fields. Everyone's got their own little farm, but it wasn't all rural, was it?
Yeah.
One article mentioned homes integrated with nature, landscaped highways.
Right?
It sounds idyllic, but also pretty elaborate.
And don't forget those roadside markets with hourly fresh produce. Wright was a stickler for details. One of the articles actually had a quote from him where he describes these homes with cantilevered terraces extending over streams, blurring the line between indoors and out.
Wow.
This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about redefining our relationship with the natural world.
He was thinking big, that's for sure. But it makes you wonder, how would this utopia actually function? I mean, an acre per family is great, but what about schools, jobs, government, all the stuff that makes a society tick? So we've painted this picture of Broadacre City, part idyllic countryside, part futuristic suburb, but let's get into the nuts and bolts.
Okay.
How did Wright envision this thing actually working?
Right.
Was everyone just tending their own acre, or were there systems in place?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
From what I've gathered, Wright was a big believer in what he called decentralization integration. Essentially, he wanted to break down those massive impersonal institutions we associate with cities
Right.
and replace them with smaller, more localized versions.
Decentralization integration,
Yeah.
say that 3 times fast.
Right.
But what does that actually look like in practice? Give me an example.
Okay, so imagine instead of massive factories polluting the environment and alienating workers, you have these smaller, cleaner, more human-scaled workshops scattered throughout Broadacre City.
Yeah.
These workshops would be owned and operated by the people who live there, producing goods locally and sustainably.
So it's about bringing jobs closer to home,
Exactly.
reducing waste, and giving individuals more control over their work lives. That makes sense.
Right.
But what about things like education or government? You can't exactly decentralize those, can you?
Well, Wright would argue that you can, at least to a degree.
Okay.
He envisioned a system of small, community-based schools tailored to the needs of the local population.
Okay.
And as for government, he believed in a more direct, participatory democracy
Huh.
where citizens had a greater say in how their communities were run.
It's a pretty radical departure from the way we do things now.
It is.
But there's a certain logic to it.
Yeah.
If you distribute power and resources more evenly,
Right.
in theory, you create a more equitable and self-sufficient society.
Right.
But I have to ask, in all this talk about individual empowerment and decentralization,
Yeah.
where does the architect fit in?
That's a great question. And it brings us to one of the more controversial aspects of Broadacre City,
Okay.
right? Saw a very prominent, even central role for architects in his utopian vision.
Really?
They weren't just designing buildings. They were essentially the planners, the organizers, the guardians of this new social order.
Wow, talk about a power trip.
Right.
But seriously, that seems like an awful lot of responsibility to place on one profession.
You're not wrong to be a little wary.
Okay.
And in fact, this is one of the main criticisms leveled at the Broadacre City.
What's that?
The potential for a kind of benevolent dictatorship by design, where a select few, no matter how well-intentioned, end up dictating the terms of everyone else's lives.
It makes you wonder, can you truly design a utopia? Or
Yeah.
are those two things fundamentally incompatible?
Yeah.
It all sounds good on paper. But then you factor in human nature, the messiness of reality. It's a recipe for unintended consequences.
Exactly, and that's something that even the most ardent supporters of Broadacre City have to grapple with.
Yeah.
There are always going to be limitations to what you can achieve through design alone.
For sure. And that leads us to another important question raised by our listeners. Were there any, inherent flaws or blind spots in Wright's thinking? So we've been dissecting Broadacre City,
Yeah.
the good, the potentially problematic,
Right.
and everything in between.
Yeah.
But did any of it actually ever get built?
Why?
Did Wright ever get to see even a glimpse of his utopia become reality?
Well, if you're talking about a full-fledged Broadacre City with every detail in place, then no.
Right.
It never materialized in that sense.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean his ideas didn't leave a mark.
Really?
Yeah.
I have to admit, when I picture those utopian illustrations of Broadacre City with their perfectly integrated homes and lush landscapes, and then I compare that to the often chaotic sprawl of modern suburbs,
Yeah.
it's hard to see the connection.
You're right. They're not exactly mirror images.
Right.
Remember, Wright was way ahead of his time.
Okay.
He was talking about things like sustainability, decentralization, and the importance of connecting with nature long before they became mainstream ideas.
So you're saying Broadacre City was more of a philosophical influence?
Yeah.
An inspiration for later architects and planners?
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about philosophy. There were actual architectural projects that were directly influenced by Broadacre City.
Okay.
One example that comes to mind is the Marin County Civic Center in California.
Oh, yeah.
It was one of Wright's later works, and while it's not a full-blown Broadacre community,
Right.
it incorporates a lot of those key elements.
Right.
The low-slung design that blends with the landscape,
Uh-huh.
the emphasis on natural light and ventilation, the idea of bringing government functions closer to the people.
So even though he couldn't build an entire Broadacre City from scratch, he found ways to weave those ideas into his individual projects.
Exactly, and it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
Think about the massive suburban expansion that took place in America after World War II.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying Levittown was Wright's brainchild,
Right.
but his ideas about individual home ownership,
Yeah.
access to green space,
Uh-huh.
and a less congested way of life,
Okay.
those ideas were definitely in the air.
Right.
And they resonated with a lot of people who were looking for an alternative to crowded, industrialized cities.
It's like Broadacre City, even in its unrealized form, became a touchstone for a whole generation of architects and urban planners.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study, even today.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even the most utopian visions can have a real-world impact, even if it's not always in the way the original visionary intended.
It makes you think,
Right.
if Frank Lloyd Wright was alive today,
Yeah.
how would he view our modern cities and suburbs? Would he be inspired by the progress we've made in areas like sustainability and technology?
Right.
Or would he still see us as those cave dwellers, clinging to outdated modes of living?
Now, that is a question I'd love to hear his answer to.
Me too. But in the absence of a time machine,
Yeah.
I guess it's up to us to grapple with those questions.
For sure.
What can we learn from Broadacre City, both its successes and its failures, as we continue to shape the world around us?
It's a conversation worth having, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And on that note, we want to hear from you. What stood out to you about Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City? Do you think it was a utopian dream doomed to fail, or did it hold valuable insights that we're only now beginning to appreciate? Head over to our website where you can find more information about Broadacre City, including those fascinating illustrations we were talking about. And while you're there, drop us a line and let us know your takeaways from this deep dive. We're always up for a good conversation. Until next time, keep those minds open, keep those questions coming, and most importantly, keep exploring the world around